Welcome to The Cutting Floor, a weekly podcast of West Cannon Baptist Church. Hi, I'm Emily, and with me is Pastor Kelly. He is our pastor of adult ministries and missions. This week, your sermon covered Genesis 12, verse 4 through 20. In your sermon, you've briefly touched on how Genesis 12, verse 3 connects to the Great Commission. Can you further explain this connection?
It's actually a great topic for the cutting floor because there was more of it in my notes than made it into the message. And for those who may have had the handout on Sunday, it was actually listed in the intro. But I moved it in my notes to in verse 8 where I talked about, and then they called upon the name of the Lord. And to see a really neat connection between that first call on the Lord in Genesis 4 following the seed of promise being announced, what's called the proto-evangelion, the first appearance of the gospel, to this in chapter 12:8, following verse 3, which many consider to be the Great Commission of the Old Testament. The idea is that God had a plan for the nations from the beginning. And even though as he moved towards using Abraham and developing a people for blessing, the blessing was never to remain just for them, but it was God's use of them as a conduit to bless all nations. Other texts in the Old Testament that kind of continue that theme, we see that in Exodus 19, verses 4 and 6, where at Sinai, God says that if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you will be my treasured possession among all peoples. But then he continues, then you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And that idea of the priesthood function is to be the voice of God to the nations and to mediate his blessing. Psalm 67 also talks about letting the nations be glad and sing for joy, that all the peoples will praise you because his people had make his way known. And then finally, Isaiah 49:6, he says, it is too light a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to bring back the preserved of Israel. But I will also make you as a light to the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. And so Genesis 12:3, people I think rightly see as the unveiling that concept that the Great Commission that Jesus gives his disciples in Matthew 28 is not something brand new. It's just an explanation that they are now the ones to carry forth that message to all the nations.
In verse 16, it says that Pharaoh dealt with Abram well for Sarah's sake. What does that mean?
Well, part of Abram's deceit of claiming Sarai as his sister rather than his wife, and with their traveling, there was no father figure. And so in that world, the father would be the one, when you think of in terms of dowry or gifts to kind of win his favor, that Abram would have been the one that Pharaoh looked to. And so once he had brought Sarah into his palace or into his household, as it may say, the idea was to kind of keep in Abram's favor as kind of her relative. And so Abram benefited. And then in the rest of that verse, it talks about some of the gifts that were given to Abram as a result of that relationship.
What does it mean in verse 19 when it says that Pharaoh took Sarah as his wife? Did they actually get married?
That's a good question. And to consider what taking as a wife meant in terms of, and when I first read the question, I thought, well, must be a different translation, because in verse 15, it simply says, and she was taken into Pharaoh's house. And so, but later then Pharaoh himself says that, why did you do this? Why did you say she is my sister so that I took her for my wife? I think part of it is that aspect of a pharaoh or a king in those days with a harem and multiple wives kind of claiming her or, unfortunately, almost acquiring her as part of that household doesn't necessarily mean that relationship was consummated. And even some of the translations that talk in that verse almost make it a conditional. Some say, why did you say this? So that I might have taken her to me. Some that I could have taken. And I think that's a little bit unnecessary in terms of the actual language. But I think I think that the thought is that the relationship was not consummated. And although it's not clear here, I think one of the reasons where it's helpful to see that that's not an unrealistic reading is because, as we'll see in a few weeks in Genesis 20, when Abram does the same thing with Abimelech. And there it also says that Abimelech took her. But then very quickly following, and I don't want to get too ahead and take some of the future messages, but then after that same verb, he took her, but he says now Abimelech had not approached her. And so I think there the idea is that there was no physical relationship yet. He had simply made her as part of his harem. And in fact, God does intervene and so protects Sarai in chapter 20. And I think similarly, it's a right parallel inference in chapter 12.
So probably not an actual marriage.
Correct. I don't think there would have been a major ceremony or anything of that nature.
How did Pharaoh know that the plagues on his house were a result of Abram lying about Sarah being his sister?
It's not clear in the text, and there are several suggestions about how that could have come about. There's also quite a bit of speculation as to what those plagues might have been. But as you think about even in Jonah's time, a similar account of a man of God disobeying and bringing judgment as opposed to blessing, that they cast lots and the lot fell on Jonah. We know that the Egyptians often had these wise men or that would interpret dreams or to figure it out. Another possibility is the timing, and particularly if it was some type of dysfunction that kind of affected Pharaoh and the timing of Sarai, he might have just gone to her and said, hey, what's going on? So she might have told him, yeah, really, I'm not Abram's sister, I'm his wife. So it's not clear exactly how he knew, but Abram's response wasn't say, well, it's not me. So it became pretty apparent through whatever circumstances or method that Pharaoh understood what was the cause and went to Abram to address it.
Did Abraham anticipate God would intercede to save Sarah from the situation?
Again, we're kind of left to speculate, but I don't know that Abram thought that far ahead. I think, one, because had he thought that God would intervene to save Sarai, why wouldn't he have trusted God to intervene and save him if he simply told the truth, as opposed to creating this scheme and perpetrating this deceit that backfired? I think the other reason that there was no anticipation is that we don't have any blessing by God. And as I alluded to at the very close about Abram's growing faith and some failure here, that we're going to see a really exciting demonstration of faith in Genesis 22, where God, and he in obedience does the hard thing. And Hebrews says that Abraham believed something amazing about God, that God would intervene to resolve what appeared to be impossible situation. So in this case, I think if Abram really trusted in God, he would have told the truth. So I don't think he had thought that far ahead.
If you have any questions from the sermon or the sermon passage that you would like to have answered on the podcast, please email them by 8 a.m. on Tuesday morning to questions@westcannon.org. We'll see you next week.